Welcome back. In our previous sessions, we've been talking about the preamble of the Constitution, its first sentence, and Article 1, the congressional powers and congressional structure. We're now going to be transitioning into the next article of the Constitution, Article 2, all about the presidency. We'll talk about the structure of the presidency and also then talk about specific presidential powers. We're going to talk about words, the very word, the president, for example, but we're also going to talk about numbers. The number 1, there's one president. We'll talk about the number 4, he serves for 4 years. The number 35, the age at which one becomes eligible for the presidency. We'll talk about the number of electors, how the Electoral College was actually designed and why it was designed, how it was apportioned. So let's begin, and eventually we're going to talk a lot about this picture, which is a painting of the Washington family, a very famous painting, which will actually, I think, sum up a lot of the features of the founders' presidency. If you actually understand this picture, you understand a lot about the early presidency. Let's begin with the very word, president. Now, under the Articles of Confederation, there was a presiding officer, a president, but he looked nothing like the presidency, like the president under the Constitution. That presiding officer under the Articles of Confederation was basically just a fellow who held a gavel in the Congress, who sort of was picked by members of Congress and who rotated out of that office quite frequently. That person had no independent national mandate, independent of Congress, had no veto pen, no pardon pen, no power of appointment, no direct superintendence of an executive branch of government, no commander-in-chief power, no explicit authority to receive ambassadors, no implied authority to negotiate treaties and conduct foreign policy, no immunity from, no fixed term of office, no immunity from being instructed or even recalled by his state delegation, by his state legislature. No guaranteed national salary, a very short term of office, very different from 4 years, perpetually re-eligible. No entitlement, indeed, to serve again and again and again without mandatory rotation. So that president under the Articles of Confederation was just the faintest shadow of the presidency under the Constitution. So one question is, why did they call the person president then? And I think one idea may have been to slightly ease the transition from the Articles of Confederation, to try to persuade Americans that this new system wasn't a total break with everything that they had come to expect under the Articles of Confederation. Remember that in Article 1, the Constitution calls the first branch Congress, just as under the Articles of Confederation there's a thing called Congress. But recall that the new Congress is really different than the old Congress, as we talked about. It's a real legislature. It's bicameral. It's going to be able to pass laws. One branch is going to be directly elected by ordinary people, a very, very different kind of body. Even the Senate, which is the part of the new Congress that looks most like the old Congress, insofar as the Senate is picked by state legislatures originally, as were congressmen in the Articles of Confederation. Each state is represented equally in the Senate, as was true under the Articles of Confederation. So in those two respects, the Senate looks a little like the new Senate looks a little like the old Congress. But even the new Senate, recall, is fundamentally different in that senators are going to be voting as individuals per capita rather than as a state bloc. They're going to serve for 6-year terms rather than for 1-year terms. They're going to be immune from state recall and mandatory instruction. They're going to be paid by the national government. They're going to be perpetually re-eligible, whereas under the Articles of Confederation, there were sort of mandatory term limits for these ambassador-like congressmen who basically voted as a bloc, as a delegation in a thing that looked a lot like the UN. So the Senate the new Senate looks a little like the old Congress, and yet even there we see profound differences. Now, with the presidency, the new president looks almost nothing like the old presiding officer under the Articles of Confederation. So one idea, though, is still we'll use these old labels, and that will make this new office perhaps go down a little easier with ordinary citizens. And here's a second reason. I think the framers understood that the first president would be George Washington. We'll talk a lot about why that's so. In fact, over the course of these lectures, George Washington will emerge again and again and again as someone whom we need to understand in a deep way to understand our Constitution. Recall that at the Philadelphia Convention that drafted the Constitution, Washington was actually the presiding officer of that convention. And there, he really was a little bit like the presiding officer under the Articles of Confederation. He held a gavel, but he didn't have all sorts of vast powers, at least formal powers, at Philadelphia. He had a lot of informal sway because everyone so respected him. And indeed, everyone at Philadelphia and throughout the country knew that Washington, if Virginia ratifies the Constitution, will be the first chief executive of the United States. He towers head and shoulders above everyone else. And in some ways, they designed, the Philadelphia framers did, the presidency for George Washington. And in this way, I think it was perhaps apt that they decided to call this new chief executive president because, of course, that was the label that George Washington had at the Philadelphia Convention. He was the presiding officer, the president at Philadelphia. He was referred to at Philadelphia as Mr. President. And so I think maybe one idea is just they became so comfortable with the idea of calling George Washington Mr. President in Philadelphia that they used that explicit label for the new office, the chief executive position under the Constitution that they designed for George Washington. Now, one other related difference between the presiding officer under the Constitution and the presiding officer under the Articles of Confederation is the presiding officer under the Articles of Confederation, the president, if you will, basically was there when Congress was in session, but Congress wasn't always in session. It didn't always have a quorum. The new president is going to be president of the United States, not merely president of Congress. And the United States as an entity, as an ongoing entity, is always in session. So I began by saying we're going to be talking about some numbers. A key number is the number 1. There is one and only one president at any time. That's not true of Congress, which is a multi-member body, 2 houses. Each house actually needed to be big enough to be genuinely representative of, to enjoy the confidence of the citizenry. The judiciary is a multi-member body. The presidency is singular and unique. It revolves around one person. And let me give you a couple of other numbers. One person, 24/7, 365. One person always there. Congress will go in and out of session. Courts will go in and out of session. But America is always in session, always needs a presiding officer at the helm. That person is the president. And there may be emergencies that arise, crises, foreign invasions, foreign policy crises, hurricanes, and the like. And those opportunities, maybe land will become available in the West if Napoleon is suddenly interested maybe in selling the entire Louisiana territory to the United States. There are going to be unique challenges and opportunities that may arise. And when they arise, Congress might not be in session. The Supreme Court might not be in session. They take summer breaks. But the presidency will always be in session. He's the president of the United States. And one important way then to think about this office is what sorts of things need to get done to preserve the United States as an ongoing enterprise and And when you ask yourself that question, you can begin to see how presidents may sometimes, at least temporarily, need to do things to keep the United States afloat, to respond to challenges or opportunities until the Congress can be brought back into session. So one president, 24/7, 365, always at the helm, always in session, because America is always in session. Okay, so I've talked about some numbers. The number 1, 24/7, 365. Let's talk now about the number 4. The presidency is a 4-year term of office. And at the founding, perpetually re-eligible. You can be elected again and again and again. And we might say, well, what's the big deal? Today you look out and most governors have 4-year terms. But that wasn't true at the founding. Modern governorships, and I'm going to come back to this, have actually emerged as imitations to some extent, echoes of the modern presidency. When the Constitution was drafted, no chief executive, no governor, no president. Some of the states called their chief executives governors. Some called them presidents. The ones who called their chief executive presidents, by the way, had particularly weak presiding officers. Governors, as a rule, were stronger than presidents in the various states. But no state gave its chief executive a 4-year term. In the state with the most powerful governorship, which is probably Massachusetts, that's the one state where the governor had a veto pen that he uniquely wielded, it's a 1-year term. In most states, it's actually a 1-year term of office. Only New York has a 3-year term, and now the framers of the Constitution are proposing to give a president a 4-year term. And they're creating a vastly more powerful president than any state governorship, because now this president's going to be able to pick his own advisors rather than be stuck with a council picked by the legislature. President's going to, in fact, pick his own cabinet officers. He's going to have a veto pen, which only Massachusetts has, a more powerful pardon pen than in most of the states. He's going to be commander-in-chief of the armed forces and going to be able to receive ambassadors and be head of state. He's going to have vast powers, vastly more powers than any state governor has, and now you're giving him a much longer term of office than most states. I think 10 of the 13 states, I think, had 1-year terms. I have to double check on that, but it's something like that. So why? And he's independently elected of the legislature, too. In most states, in 8 of the 13 states, the legislature picks the chief executive rather than being independently elected. So why would you give him a 4-year term? And I think there are 2 stories here. There's a domestic balance story, a kind of checks and balances story, and there's a geostrategic story, an international law, international and foreign affairs story. Here's the domestic story. Remember that the framers are modeling their Constitution in some respects on states, but then they're tweaking some of the numbers. Because of geography, we're going to have members of the House of Representatives elected every 2 years, and senators every 6 years, because it takes longer to get from the extremes of the continent to the national capital, more travel time, because it takes a little longer to bone up on foreign affairs, to actually learn about other parts of the country, other parts of the world. So you need to give federal lawmakers a little bit more time in office because of the learning curve. So if you're going to have, and so in states, most of the state legislators are picked annually. But members of Congress, House of Representatives every 2 years, biannually, senators every 6 years. So a 4-year presidency kind of roughly counterbalances 2 and 6. In states, if you've got a 1-year House of Representatives and maybe even a 1-year Senate, well, then maybe you want a 1-year chief executive position. So there's a kind of balance within the state that your executive office roughly counterbalances the legislative term of office. But because, for geographic reasons, in part, we're going to have a longer term of office for members of the House and Senate, we should have a counterbalancing longer term of office for the presidency. Now, there's some other, here, that's the kind of the domestic balance story. The idea was we're creating a much more powerful legislature, a much more powerful Congress than we had in the Articles of Confederation. So to counterbalance that more powerful Congress, we need a more powerful executive, precisely because this new Congress is going to have a lot more power. We have to break up its power with bicameralism compared to the old Congress and counterbalance it with an executive who's going to be able to keep it in check, for example, with a muscular veto pen. Many of the framers, led by James Madison at Philadelphia, thought that state governments had kind of spiraled out of control a little bit, that state legislatures were too dominant within state governments. They ran roughshod over rights. They weren't strongly enough counterbalanced by judges and by state executives. And so if this new federal government was going to avoid the mistakes that some of the state governments had made, we needed to break the legislature up into two, break the old Congress into two houses, and counterbalance it with a stronger executive who has a longer term of office, an independent mandate, a veto pen, someone who basically would resist the inclination to vote for stuff that might seem popular in the moment but actually would be contrary to the long-term interests of the American people, to considerations of justice and fairness. One individual legislator might not care that much about his reputation. No one's really going to notice whether he goes along or not. But a president, he would care about history and reputation, because he'd be one person with all eyes on him. And so you want to kind of give that person a little bit more a powerful base to resist legislative encroachments. So that's the domestic balance story. The foreign affairs story is this person, your chief executive, is going to have to go up against other heads of state in the world, and they serve for life. They're hereditary. And so you want some stability in foreign affairs, and so you want someone who actually is going to be able to look a treaty partner in the eye and basically say, listen, I'm going to be able to, I speak for the American people, not just in this month, this year, but more enduringly. There's the domestic story to counterbalance the legislature, and a foreign affairs story, both of which argued for a longer term of office. Now, here's the interesting thing. Once the framers of the Constitution got the American people to go for this 2-4-6 model, 2-year House, 4-year presidency, 6-year Senate, some of the states actually began to adjust and began to move away from annual elections for lawmakers to biannual. Now, as I said, in I think 48 of the 50 states, you have governors who serve for 4 years on the presidential model. And that gradual shift away from annual elections to longer terms of office begins with the adoption of the Constitution itself. And shortly thereafter, states start to amend their constitutions to create longer terms of office for governors and now longer terms of office for legislators too. It's not just 4 years, though, remember. It's 4 years perpetually re-eligible. You can run again and again and again for life, no term limits. Now, today, the Constitution has been amended. A president can't be elected for more than two terms, 10 years in total, because you could imagine a half term. We'll talk about that in later sessions. But at the founding, president was perpetually re-eligible. And in the states, those governors who were perpetually re-eligible basically almost always kept running again and again and again, and they either died in office or left office very shortly before their death. John Hancock, basically, it's annual in Massachusetts. He's the governor of Massachusetts. He runs again and again. He steps down very briefly in the mid-1780s and then keeps running again and again, and he dies in office. And the governor of New Jersey, Livingston, again and again and again, and then he dies in office. And the governor of Connecticut runs again and again and again, and steps down a year before his death. George Clinton, remember, in New York, it's a 3-year term. I think he serves 6 terms, almost 2 decades, steps down briefly and then is elected even for a 7th term. He ends up dying in office not as governor of New York, but as vice president of the United States. George Washington sets a different example. He does not die in office. He got unanimously elected. Every single elector voted for him. We're going to talk about the Electoral College in our next session. He got unanimously re-elected. He could have been, I think, unanimously re-elected in 1796-97, but he chose to step down. And in choosing to step down, he began a tradition which is going to later become constitutionalized in the constitutional amendment of a 2-term presidency. So he sets a different example than the state governors had. Had Washington stayed in office until his death, maybe a tradition might have emerged in which the presidency became kind of a lifetime office as a practical matter, instead of what it is now become. So the text says 4 years, perpetually re-eligible, but Washington begins to establish a different tradition. Washington, in fact, establishes all sorts of precedents, therefore, not just as our first president, and he does all sorts of things that later presidents will imitate, but he also sets some important precedents as our first as our first ex-president. He comes to embody the idea of an elder statesman who's available for advice if necessary, but isn't constantly intervening in national affairs. It allows his successor basically to govern peacefully, hands off power to someone else, and then fades back into the farm, goes to the ranch. And that model is not as visible in the text of the original written Constitution, which, as I said, envisions perpetual re-eligibility. It's a model instead that is embodied by the choices made by George Washington, most particularly to leave office, even though he could have been re-elected. In our next session, we're going to talk a lot about Washington. We're going to talk also about the Electoral College and how it's apportioned. We're going to talk about eligibility rules for the presidency. We'll talk about, for example, another number, 35 years. And I'm going to end that session with this picture, which is from a chapter of the book, America's Constitution, a biography. We're now into Chapter 4. This is the picture that begins Chapter 4. And we're going to end our next session with a careful examination of this painting, which is of the Washington family. I'm going to try to persuade you that if you understand the early presidency, you understand a lot of elements of this painting. This painting is going to sum up a lot of the great themes of America's presidency under the original Constitution. So stay tuned.